Hi everyone, I'm Robbie Bieber, and welcome back to another Collodion chat. It's been a little while since I did one of these, and today I want to talk about my favorite weirdly controversial subject in wet plate photography, which is, do you need to attend a wet plate workshop if you want to learn to shoot collodion photography? And if you don't need to, what are some reasons you might want to? So just a real quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start by trying to answer that question, right? Do you really need to attend a workshop? And given that I, have published a how-to series on YouTube, you can probably guess what my answer is. But our second part is going to be, do you want to attend a workshop, right? What are some reasons that you might want to go to one? What are some things that you might get out of a workshop that would make it worth the money? How to pick a workshop if you do decide that you want to attend one. And I'm just going to wrap up with some updates about kind of what I've had going on recently, what you can expect from the channel and from me in the near future, including how to get your hands on one of these wet plate storage boxes that I've been working on. A little bit of subtle product placement I'm going to work in here. So let's get started. We'll start out with our first topic, which is, do you need to attend a wet plate workshop, right? You are someone who is interested in collodion photography. You think tintypes are really cool. You want to try it for yourself. Do you need to show up to a wet plate workshop? Do you need to pay money to have someone teach you how to do the process? And the answer to this one, I think, is just straightforwardly no. A lot of people will very vehemently disagree with this. Some of those people are people who sell workshops. Not to say that they are, deliberately lying to you, but I do think there's a little bit of a conflict of interest in there when some people are answering that question. I think it's just indisputable that it is possible to start learning collodion photography without attending a workshop. So I did go to a workshop when I first got started, but I have a friend who started the process also in LA, also at very close to the same time. I think he got his starter kit like maybe a month after I got mine. He never went to a workshop, and honestly, he became a very proficient collodion photographer, every bit as good as me, if not better. Probably at about the same pace that I did. I don't think that I, was way out ahead of him because I went to that workshop. And even in my case, I did sign up for a workshop, but collodion workshops tend to be scheduled pretty far in advance, right? It's not something that everyone does, very frequently. And so when I signed up for my workshop, I had a couple of months between signing up and attending, and I had already started ordering, the various chemistry and equipment I was going to need for the process. And so I did realize about a week before my workshop that I had accumulated all the equipment that I need. I had already purchased Chemical Pictures, which is Quinn's book on wet plate photography. I'd already read the whole thing. And so one day I said, screw it. I'm gonna go down to the shared garage of the apartment building I was living in at the time. I set up a 3/4 of an Amazon box on a folding table, and I threw a bed sheet over my head to make a dark box. And I processed my first plate right there. And I was really scared. I didn't think it was going to work, but it actually worked great. This isn't the best plate that I've ever made, but this is my first plate. I cheated a little bit by putting my dinky little Paul C. Buff Einstein light directly in the frame for a little bit of a bright field glass image. But this worked. I popped the flash one time, I took it down, I developed it, and I was just ecstatic as that image came out in the developer, and especially once it went into the fixer. And, I had done it on my own. I just read the book, I followed the directions, and it worked. So I did proceed to go to the workshop the next week, and it was a good time. It was helpful to have someone kind of show me the ropes. But I wouldn't say that I learned anything there that I couldn't have learned through experience. So there may have been a time, certainly, when, learning materials were a lot less accessible. There was a time when, pretty much anyone who was practicing wet plate was either a student of, Mark Osterman, Francis Scully, John Coffer, or a student of their student, so on and so forth. There weren't good modern manuals. But nowadays, there are at least 3 good modern wet plate manuals that I know of, right? There's the basic collodion manual by Mark Osterman and Francis Scully. There's Chemical Pictures by Quinn. And there is John Coffer's Doer's Guide, right? All 3 of which people swear by. I think any one of those books, you can get them if you read them and you diligently follow the instructions inside, you can make a plate. Of course, I've put my full, my full Collodion Basics Guide. It's a 10-part series here on YouTube where I, kind of try to show you the process and all the steps you need to make a tintype. That is a little bit dated at this point, but the content I think is still decent. And I've met several people who learned to do wet plate just by watching my videos. So you definitely don't need to go to a workshop. Now, there are people who will say that it's impossible to learn without, someone showing you, which is just demonstrably not true. Another thing that people will say is that, it will ultimately save you money if you go to a workshop, because if you don't go to a workshop, you're going to make so many mistakes as a beginner that you're going to waste more money in chemistry and in supplies than it would cost you to just go to a workshop. And I've got some prices of workshops that I just looked up over here. I will get more into that later. But generally, you're looking at least a couple hundred a day to attend a wet plate workshop. Probably closer to 1,000 in most cases for the entire workshop. So usually multiple days. So for comparison, UV Photographics sells a starter Collodion chemistry kit for $185. Boston Sullivan sells a starter chemistry kit for $186. And for $268, they also sell the same kit, but with a bunch of glassware and trays and other equipment that you would need. So of course, you have to take into account cameras and lenses and so on and so forth. But basically, you would have to completely ruin several starter kits worth of chemistry to make up the cost of a wet plate workshop, which for most people, I think is just not realistic. So if you don't want to go to a workshop, if this is something that you think you just want to try on your own, by all means, go for it. Don't let me stop you. Don't let anyone who's being nasty in Facebook comments stop you. It's doable. It's been done. I've seen people done it. I've seen people do it. Yeah, you don't need to go to a workshop. So this brings us to our second part is you don't have to go to a workshop, but do you want to go to a workshop? Because obviously, this is a product that people offer. It's generally successful. They keep happening. People keep attending them and generally being happy with the results. So let's talk a little bit about, what it's like to go to a workshop, why you might want to go to it, what types of people it might appeal to, and just, what you might get out of it. So this is maybe a little bit kitschy, but I think a good indicator for are you a person who would really benefit from a workshop is if you are reading instructions to do something, whether it's baking or assembling furniture, setting up a new piece of electronics, what have you. If the directions tell you to read all the instructions before starting, do you actually do that, or do you just kind of jump in and try it from the beginning? I think if you're the type of person who really likes to read the instructions thoroughly, to know what you're getting into before you get into something, you will probably do well as a self-starter in Collodion. If you're the kind of person who likes to just kind of jump into things, learn by doing, and go for it right from the start, I think you might get more value out of an in-person workshop. And the reason I say that is that Collodion is not a super complicated process. At the end of the day, it's a pretty straightforward set of steps. And if you get a good manual, and if you follow the instructions, fastidiously and to the point, you're very cautious, you're careful to keep things clean, to do exactly what's written down in the text, then you're probably going to have good results, right? People like to talk about Collodion as kind of an unpredictable process, but it really isn't. It's straightforward chemistry. The chemicals are going to do the same thing every time, as long as they are not contaminated, as long as they are, poured and mixed and used appropriately. It's not something that is going to kind of wildly vary based on many changes in, temperature, humidity, or so on and so forth. Obviously, extremes do matter, right? It's harder to kind of get clean plates in 100-degree summer outside than it is in climate control. But within reason, Collodion pretty much does what you expect it to do if you follow the steps properly. But if you're a little bit loose with the steps, if you take some liberties, you're going to find out pretty quickly that there are some things in the process you can take liberties with, and there are some things you have to be really careful with, and it can be hard to figure that out by trial and error if you're making a lot of mistakes. So if you like to be a little bit more carefree, if you're not into, kind of very rigorously following a process set down in a document, it helps to have someone over your shoulder who can say, hey, that step that you're neglecting is actually really important, or who can know that, maybe you're making a small mistake, but it's not a big deal, and they can just let you kind of learn as you go. So that is my kind of archetype of the person who should really go to a workshop. That being said, regardless of your personality type, how you like to learn, it can still be a good idea to go to a workshop, right? So let's talk about just some general benefits, regardless of your ability level or your proclivities, right? So one thing that's nice about a wet plate workshop is you get a chance to try before you buy. Now, obviously, if you are already 100% gung-ho, you know for a fact that you want to do this process, you're going to end up buying that equipment anyways. But if you're at all unsure, if you think there's any chance that you're going to, pick this up and then put it down and never touch it again, maybe you don't want to spend several $100s on, chemicals and equipment. Now, it is worth noting that for the cost of most of these workshops, you can probably get a pretty decent Collodion setup going. I'm not sure exactly what the lower bound is on getting started in wet plate. That's actually something I want to explore in a future video, is just how cheap can you make a plate for. But these workshops are pricey, and you can find affordable cameras, you can find affordable chemistry in small quantities, you can make do with Tupperware bins instead of real trays, you can tray sensitize instead of getting a silver bath, that kind of thing. So there are ways to do this affordably. But trying before you buy isn't just about the cost, it's also about kind of the hassle and the overhead. And maybe you spend $900 on a workshop and you figure out that you don't like this. And it's not just that it saved you having to buy all that equipment, it's also that it saved you having a pile of equipment that you now have to get rid of, right? So if you're not sure that you actually want to own and pay for and store all this equipment, which is not only somewhat expensive and takes up space, but can also be difficult to completely get rid of if you decide to divest from it, it might not hurt to go out and spend a day or a weekend or longer, getting a hands-on intro to the process and seeing how you feel about it. Another aspect of the wet plate workshop that I think can be really enjoyable is just kind of the fellowship aspect of it, right? So I went to a workshop back in June 18th. Alan Barnes was teaching at, I think, Santa Monica College. And aside from the actual content of the workshop, there were like, I think 10 or 12 people there who are all kind of enthusiasts of, photography, analog photography, interested in wet plate. Just people who, had some of the same interests as me. And it can be really neat to hang out with a group with kind of a niche shared interest for a period of time to make some friends, right? I'm still follow a bunch of those people on Instagram and kind of see what they're up to. So it can just be a fun way to spend a weekend. And as a kind of a combination of this and the try before you buy point, I've actually met a couple people who have they've basically been repeat attendees to the same workshop, right? So there can be people who, maybe want to shoot wet plate occasionally. They don't have any interest in buying all the equipment and maintaining it themselves, but sometimes they want to get out and make some plates and hang out with other people who are into wet plate. And a workshop can be a really good venue for that, if you have the disposable income for it. And then the final point that I want to bring up here, people who would really benefit from a workshop. I've really been focusing on hobbyists here this whole time. I think of wet plate generally as a hobby. I think most people who do wet plate are hobbyists. But if you are trying to start a wet plate business, right, if your goal is to make money from this and become a professional, I do think it's kind of a no-brainer to put some money in for a workshop up front. Obviously part of being a hobbyist is that you have the luxury to learn at your own pace, to explore things you have time, and it doesn't really matter if it takes you a year or 2 years or 3 years to become really proficient. But if you're thinking this is an investment, right, if you're spending all this money and you want to start seeing some returns from it, then you need to accelerate your learning as much as possible. And I think joining a workshop, having some hands-on instruction, and being able to talk to someone who is probably a professional wet plate photographer is, potentially a a really good stepping stone, right? Something that if you're getting an actual, kind of return on the investment, I really just think it's a straightforward decision. Yes, you should definitely do it. So let's say that you do want to go to a workshop, right? How are you going to pick one? What are the facts that you should look at? Who do you want to learn from? How much do you want to pay? So let's start by talking about proximity. I have met some people who have traveled very long distances to attend workshops with either kind of their favorite photographers or with practitioners who are really famous in the field, who maybe pioneered, wrote manuals, people who are just really well-known teachers. And the first thing I would say is that's a great thing to do if you have the money, if you want to make a trip of it, if you want that experience. I would not in a million years begrudge the prices that those people charge or the money that goes into travel. I think if that is an experience you're looking for, it's 100% worth it. But it's not something you have to strive for if you're not necessarily looking to spend that much money. I think looking for someone who is as close to you as possible, even if they're not necessarily the most kind of vaunted teacher, is fine. At the end of the day, this is a pretty simple process. It seems very complicated from the outside, but once you're familiar with it, it's a pretty simple set of mechanical steps. And any competent teacher is going to be able to get you where you need to be, which is having some basic proficiency, enough to kind of get started developing on your own. I don't think there is a wet plate workshop on this planet where you can walk in and in 2 or 3 or 4 days, you walk out an expert. We're all going to be a beginner at the end of our first workshop. Some of us might be slightly more advanced beginners than others, but whatever workshop you go to, there's still a long learning curve ahead of you to develop into a really competent practitioner. So when it comes to picking a teacher, let's say that you do have some options. Something I want you to keep in mind is that teaching a thing and doing the thing are always two separate skills, right? If you're looking for someone to teach you how to do something, you don't necessarily need the person who is the best at doing that thing. So in this case, someone being a really good artist, a really good wet plate photographer, does not necessarily mean that they're a great teacher. Doesn't mean that they're not a great teacher, but that in and of itself shouldn't be your primary criterion. What you want is someone who knows how to teach. And specifically, you want them to teach you the mechanics of the process. Their art could be terrible, right? They might make the most boring, lackluster plates you've ever seen in your life, but if they make technically good work and they've demonstrated an aptitude for teaching other people how to make technically good work, then that's what you're really after in a workshop, right? You want someone who can teach you the mechanics, and then you can take those skills and you can go bring your own artistic sensibilities to the work that you create in the future. So what I would look for is someone who has a reputation, not just as a photographer, or even primarily as a photography, but for teaching. Someone who has taught a lot of workshops is probably your ideal teacher. And I realize that might be a little bit of a self-defeating thing to say, as someone who may end up offering workshops sometime in the next couple of years. But it's true that if you have access to a really experienced teacher, always go for teaching experience and, students. If you can talk to students who've had positive experiences, and if their students have gone on to do good work, right? You don't necessarily care how good of work the teacher has produced. You want to see that they're producing students who can go and make good, solid, technically competent plates after they've taken their workshops. So there are lots of workshops. I'm going to drop a little bit of a cost comparison here. This is not exhaustive by any means. I just did a little bit of Googling. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the prices that I found online for workshops happening in the next 6 months or so, how they stack up to what I've seen historically, and how you should think about pricing in the workshop. So starting with the workshop that I took back in June of 2018, I paid $495 for a 2-day workshop at Santa Monica College with Alan Barnes. So that works out to $247.50 a day. You're not going to find a lot of workshops for that price in 2025, but I do think you'll find that there are some surprisingly affordable options out there still when you look at it on a per day basis. So what are prices that we have available on the modern market, right? So if you're looking nowadays, one of the first things that came up on Google was, of course, John Coffer's website. John Coffer, if you're not familiar with him, pretty famous early wet plate practitioner. Early in the modern era, right? Wrote a manual, runs Camp Tintype, a bunch of events. So for a 4-day workshop, he charges $1,350, which is a lot of money. However, it is a 4-day workshop. So his per day price is actually not bad when you compare it to other shorter workshops. He charges $337.50 a day, right? Mark Osterman and Francis Scully, also very foundational figures in modern wet plate. They don't list group prices on their website. They do list that they will do private tutorials for $750 a day. That's obviously a little bit pricey, but that's also one-on-one instruction. So when they offer group classes, those are of course going to be lower priced. But if you want to do private instruction with someone who really knows their stuff, that's kind of the range you're going to be looking at. Now, there are also a couple of big wet plate suppliers that regularly run wet plate workshops as well. So UV Photographics, that is Brian Coyler's company. Hopefully I'm not butchering his name. They do workshops periodically in the Los Angeles area, and they charge $950 for a 2-day workshop. That's $475 a day. Bostic & Sullivan in New Mexico, I believe, does 3-day workshops for $1,475. That's $491.60 a day. So as you can see, the Bostic workshop is more expensive, but on a per day basis, it's pretty similar. And then let's look at some kind of maybe lesser known names, just people that popped up on Google. Lisa, kind of can't write my own handwriting. I think it's Elanella, does $795 for a 3-day workshop down here in the South. That's $265 a day. In San Francisco at the Harvey Milk Center, Alan Barnes, who of course taught my workshop down in Santa Monica back in the day, actually does a 2-day workshop for $250, which is phenomenally affordable at $125 a day. I don't know if the center is maybe subsidizing that a little bit, right? So if you're in a major city, you may have an art center or photography center that puts on regular workshops. Down here in Florida, Andrew Wardlow is going to be doing a 1-day workshop for $450. And then in New York, the Penumbra Foundation, it looks like they do a 2-day workshop for $715. That's $357 a day. So we've seen prices there ranging from $250 up to above $1,000. You'll find that the per day prices are generally hovering around that like $350 to $450 range for the most part. Some a little bit higher, some a little lower. Obviously the market prices as a whole are less important than what's available to you locally, but just something to consider in terms of what's generally out there in the market. And I do want to point out that when it comes to length of workshop, I wouldn't say that longer is necessarily better. I took a 2-day workshop, and my experience was that I would say it was about a day and a half of really absorbing and learning material before you kind of start to burn out. That second day was mostly a lot of just kind of us making plates and experimenting. And by the end of it, I was a little bit, my brain was a little bit fried. I don't know that I could pay attention through a 3-day workshop, and I'm pretty sure that I couldn't pay attention through a 4-day workshop. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe a really good teacher can make that engaging and kind of keep you fresh throughout. But in my opinion, like 1.5 days is probably the optimal time. It's probably the optimal length of a workshop. I think 2 days is a pretty typical workshop. I think a 2-day workshop is a great period of time to kind of learn the basics of the process and just get your feet under you and get started. And then one last thing I want to point out here when it comes to picking workshops, I said that proximity is a big factor. If you live in a big city, you almost certainly have a good wet plate photographer, good solid workshops available to you. If you live somewhere that's not in a major market, right? If you're not close to a big city, if there's no one nearby you offering workshops. Another thing that you can do is just reach out to wet plate photographers in your area. You can use Google. Also, the various Collodion Facebook groups are great for kind of locating practitioners. There's actually a shared Google map of practitioners that I will try to find and put in the video description. Always feel free to reach out to people who are nearby you and just ask if they'd be interested in showing you the process, maybe teaching you something. I've had that happen a couple of times where people have just come out and I've kind of shown them the ropes. Usually if that happens, what I'll do is I'll demonstrate the process a couple times and then I'll kind of walk them through making one plate, not like a full workshop or tutorial, but just some quick instruction to kind of let them get their feet wet and get that first plate made. If you do reach out to someone like that, I think it's polite to offer to pay them. Personally, I've never taken money for that. I'm always happy to have someone interested in the process, help someone get started. But if they're willing to take some compensation, always a good idea to offer some payment for their time. So that is my somewhat controversial take on workshops. I don't think they're necessary. I think if you want to learn wet plate on your own, especially if you're a hobbyist, it's completely fine. But depending on how you like to learn, how you feel about kind of following and reading instructions, and just the experience that you're looking to have, it can be a really fun and fulfilling thing to do. It can be a great way to kind of get yourself a head start on the process and also to meet some like-minded individuals and make some friends and just become a part of kind of the broader wet plate community. So that is the topic for today, but I want to roll really quick into some updates before I finish. So what's been going on? I am obviously still doing this channel. My last video was not Collodion related. It was about the invention of photography. It neither bombed nor took off as far as viewership goes, so I don't think I'm going to pivot the channel or anything. I'm going to keep on making Collodion videos. I'll probably still do general photography topics every now and then. I've been thinking about doing a video about the Shumflug effect and focus and perspective with camera movements and how those work. And yeah, so if you're interested in that kind of general photography content, do me a favor and let me know in the comments whether you prefer to see Collodion specific content, whether you would find some more just large format and photography related content interesting. And then aside from that, I have been busy for once developing a physical product. So I have obviously released a handful of kind of 3D printed designs out into the world for free before. I've never felt comfortable selling my 3D printed wet plate accessories because I just don't like selling things that have 3D printed layer lines. But I got myself set up with a CNC recently, and I have been working on developing a bunch of plate storage boxes of the type that you have already seen at the beginning of the video. My cat is going nuts right now, so I'm going to wait a second. I don't know if you heard that. Okay, back to the video. Yeah, so I've been working on these plate storage boxes. I got the CNC specifically because I have wanted to make something like this for a long time. But it just takes a lot of time to make a bunch of these by hand. And now that I've got a robot to do the cuts for me, I can actually make these and hopefully sell them at a price that people can afford. So this is not an official product announcement yet. I will hopefully have one of those soon. I'm still in the process of getting my LLC registered and setting up my Shopify site, all that fun stuff. But I'm targeting early to mid-September. I will launch the store. I will announce it here on the channel when I do. And when that happens, I will be launching these boxes in 6 different sizes. So we are going to have 6 by 7 centimeter. Of course, good old-fashioned 4 by 5. And the neat thing about these boxes is that they do nest with each other. And all of these have sliding lids. They nest. We're going to have 5 by 7 ready to go. Note that most of these don't have handles. That's because these are earlier designs that I made for myself. And I realized after I loaded them up with plates that they do need handles. So the actual boxes that ship are going to have handles on every size aside from the 6x7. We're also going to have 5x12. You may wonder why I'm offering 5x12. It's because I have a 5x12 camera. So I figured I may as well go ahead and make a box for that size while I was at it. And of course, there's going to be 8x10 and the gargantuan 11x14. So we should have a pretty full suite of sizes when this thing launches. Just a little product development tip that I unfortunately had to learn the hard way. When you decide the very first product to offer, don't make it something that comes in 6 different sizes. It was a huge hassle to make all these, but I've got the designs. I can produce them in bulk. I can't wait to start offering these for sale. So I'm trying not to like turn this channel into just me hawking wares at you every video. But there will be occasional product announcements when I launch things like this. So those will hopefully be for sale soon. If you have a size of plate that you're going to want to order boxes for, and you don't see it here on this table, I can make them. So I will put an email address here on the screen. If you have a size you want to request, just send me an email, tell me what size you're going to want, how many of them you're going to want. Basically the way I'm going to do that is if the size you request is kind of a normal standard size, right? If you want, 16x20 or half plate or quarter plate or what have you, I'll just design it and I'll make it and I'll add it to the site and charge you, the normal price. If you want like a really weird size, right? If there's someone out there shooting, 20 centimeters by 5.5 inches, what have you, happy to make custom sizes. I'll just also charge a design fee to get that set up for the first one, and then do a regular per box price. These will also be available as DIY kits that you can assemble yourself. I'll have instructions for that, and they will be significantly less expensive if you buy them flat packed as a DIY kit versus me shipping them, fully assembled. So that's the video. That's what I've been up to. I hope this helps with making any decisions you have to make about whether you want to do a workshop, what workshop you might want to do. And until the next time I see you, happy shooting and have a great rest of your day.